HMS Sheffield. The mistake that cost a modern warship, how an Exocet missile defeated cutting-edge technology. In the South Atlantic in May 1982, the ocean seemed endless, cold, and silent. For the men aboard HMS Sheffield, that silence did not mean safety, it meant waiting. Waiting for an enemy that rarely showed itself, but could strike from hundreds of kilometers away. An enemy that did not need guns or armor. Just a missile. That early afternoon, Sheffield was sailing as part of the British task force rushed south to retake the Falkland Islands, occupied by Argentina weeks earlier. She was a modern destroyer, a proud representative of NATO naval technology at the end of the Cold War. Her role was clear: protect the aircraft carriers, act as a forward sentry, and ensure that no enemy aircraft approached undetected. But war rarely respects well-defined roles. What followed that day would enter naval history not as a great fleet engagement, but as a brutal collision between technological expectations and the human reality of modern combat. A single French-built missile launched by an Argentine aircraft was enough to doom an entire warship, and to permanently change how navies around the world would think about war at sea. This is not just the story of an attack. It is the story of decisions made under pressure. Of systems that failed not because they were weak, but because they were operated by exhausted, tense, overloaded men. And of sailors who, in minutes, went from routine vigilance to absolute chaos. HMS Sheffield was a Type 42 destroyer, designed primarily for air defense. In theory, she was exactly the kind of ship meant to survive in an environment saturated with aerial threats. Her primary radar, her Sea Dart missiles, and her forward position in the formation had one simple, vital mission: see first, warn first, react first. But the South Atlantic was not a NATO exercise in the North Sea. Conditions were harsh. The weather changed quickly. The distance from British bases meant long stretches of sustained tension. And above all, the Argentine threat did not come from large fleets on the horizon, but from small groups of aircraft flying low, skimming the sea, exploiting radar blind spots. From the start of the campaign, British commanders knew of one particular danger, almost mythical in its reputation: the Exocet missile. Argentina had very few of them. Very few. Each missile was precious, used only when there was a real chance of hitting a high-value target. That made every possible warning ambiguous. React to all of them and paralyze the fleet. Ignore one and it could be fatal. On the morning of May 4, 1982, two Argentine Super-Attended fighters took off carrying exactly that weapon. The plan was simple and dangerous. Fly at the edge of their range, locate a British ship with the help of a patrol aircraft, launch the missiles and return. If they failed, there would likely be no second chance. Meanwhile, aboard Sheffield, life continued in a state of constant alert. Tired crews. Systems running for hours at a time. Radar operators cycling between intense focus and moments of apparent monotony. Modern warfare demands constant attention, and punishes even the smallest lapse. Sheffield was operating as a radar picket, ahead of the main body of the fleet. That made her essential, and vulnerable. Her primary radar was active, but other systems were not always fully operational at the same time, whether due to technical limitations or moment-to-moment decisions by the combat team, trying to filter clutter, avoid false alarms, or manage overlapping communications. There was no sense of safety. There was routine. And routine in war is dangerous. Shortly after midday, signals began to appear. Indications of Argentine air activity. Nothing conclusive. No confirmed attack. For many aboard, it was just another alert among the many recorded since the conflict began. But hundreds of kilometers away, the Super-Attendeds had already received confirmation of a significant naval contact. They adjusted course. Climbed just enough to activate their radars for a few seconds, long enough to obtain a firing solution. Then they descended again, disappearing below the horizon. The launch happened without British sailors ever seeing the enemy. The AM-39 Exocet left the aircraft's wing and began its sea-skimming flight, guided by active radar. It did not need a pilot. It did not need courage. It needed only correct data, and a few minutes of unobstructed sky. Aboard Sheffield, time was about to collapse into seconds. When the final warning came, it did not arrive as absolute certainty. There was confusion. Delay. The classic difficulty of distinguishing a false contact from a real threat. And when the threat became undeniable, the window between identification and impact was already minimal. The Exocet struck the ship on the starboard side. According to later investigations, the warhead likely did not detonate as designed. But that did not save Sheffield. The missile's remaining fuel ignited upon entering the hull, spreading intense fire through internal compartments. Flammable materials, cables, insulation, fed an inferno that quickly spiraled out of control. The ship's most advanced technology could do nothing against the fire. At that moment, the fight ceased to be electronic or strategic. It became physical, suffocating, human. Sailors struggled to contain the flames, rescue the wounded, keep the ship alive. Thick black smoke filled the corridors. Electrical systems failed. Internal communications became difficult or impossible. Sheffield did not sink immediately. She held on. 4 hours. For days it even seemed possible that she might be saved. But the structural damage, combined with the intensity of the fire, had sealed her fate. 20 sailors died. And with them died a dangerous illusion. That cutting-edge technology by itself guarantees invulnerability. The missile's impact was only the beginning. Sheffield's real battle started afterward, inside the ship, where there were no radars, no missiles, no technological advantage at all. There were only men against fire. In the minutes following the attack, the crew tried to understand what had actually happened. There was no massive explosion of the kind many expected from an anti-ship missile. The hull did not split open. The ship did not immediately lose buoyancy. At first glance, it might have seemed that the worst had been avoided. But the fire was spreading silently. Unburned exocet fuel, highly flammable, turned the internal compartments into a toxic inferno. Thick, hot, poisonous smoke pushed through the passageways, making it impossible to see or breathe without proper equipment. In several areas, the heat was so intense that it warped metal structures and crippled electrical systems. The problem was not just the fire. It was the deadly combination of factors. HMS Sheffield had been designed with air defense in mind, not survival against large-scale internal fires. Many materials used for insulation and interior finishes, acceptable in peacetime, proved dangerously flammable in real combat. Cables melted, releasing toxic gases. Electrical power failed, preventing pumps and sensors from working. Without power, the ship became blind and deaf from within. Officers and sailors tried to organize damage control, but internal communications were fragmented. Some teams had no idea what was happening in other sections. In certain compartments, men fought flames without knowing that, just meters away, the fire had already made their efforts futile. Even so, no one abandoned the ship immediately. Royal Navy culture had always emphasized endurance, saving the ship as long as there was hope. And there was hope. 4 hours, many believed Sheffield could be kept afloat and towed out of the combat zone. The wounded were evacuated with great difficulty. Many had inhaled toxic smoke. Others suffered severe burns. 20 men died, not from the initial impact but from the consequences of the fire that followed. When the order to abandon ship was finally given, it was not out of panic but clarity. The fire was out of control. The internal structure was compromised. Staying aboard would only increase the death toll. Sheffield drifted silently, blackened scars along her hull, a disturbing symbol of a modern warship's vulnerability to a single successful strike. Days later, while under tow, the ship finally sank in the South Atlantic, defeated by the sea and by cumulative damage. There was no dramatic final explosion. Just the gradual disappearance of a destroyer that, not long before, had represented the cutting edge of naval warfare. News of the attack spread quickly through the British task force. Until then, the Falklands War had seemed harsh but manageable. The sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano had reinforced a sense of British naval superiority. The attack on Sheffield shattered that perception in an instant. Now everyone knew, the exocets worked. And they worked well. The psychological impact was profound. Every ship in the fleet began to imagine itself in Sheffield's place. Every combat officer understood that, in the event of a mistake, there would be no second chance. Tension, already high, became nearly constant. From that day on, procedures changed. Air surveillance was intensified. Any suspicious contact was treated with maximum seriousness. Ships adjusted formations, revised defensive protocols, reconsidered radar use and communications. The fear of revealing one's position had to be balanced against the risk of failing to see the enemy in time. Paradoxically, the exocet was not a plentiful weapon. Argentina possessed few missiles and few aircraft capable of launching them. But that did not diminish its strategic effect. On the contrary, each missile became a disproportionate threat, capable of shaping decisions at the operational level. The sinking of Sheffield also had political consequences. In the United Kingdom, the war, until then distant for much of the public, suddenly became brutally real. For the first time since World War II, a major Royal Navy ship had been lost in combat. The dead had names. They had faces. They had families. And that changed the tone of the conflict. On the Argentine side, the attack was seen as a strategic and symbolic victory. A British ship had been hit, not just any ship, but a modern, protected destroyer, part of the fleet's core. It proved that the task force was not invulnerable. But that victory carried an unintended consequence. The British became more cautious, more alert, more determined. The element of surprise, so decisive in the attack on Sheffield, would be hard to repeat. Even so, the damage was done. Modern naval warfare had revealed its most brutal face, brief, precise, and profoundly human in its consequences. A single missile, launched without the enemy ever being seen, had been enough to change the psychological course of an entire campaign. And at the center of that story stood Sheffield, not as a simple technological failure, but as a reminder that at sea, there is no perfect system. There are only people, decisions, and seconds that can never be recovered. As the days passed and the initial shock gave way to cold analysis, a question began to echo among commanders, naval engineers, and crews across the British task force. How could a ship designed to defend the fleet against air attack be struck in this way? The answer was not found in a single failure or a single mistake. It lay in the delicate intersection of technology, doctrine, human fatigue, and a war fought at the very limits of what those systems had been designed to face. Sheffield was not an unprepared ship. On the contrary, her Sea Dart missile system had been developed precisely to intercept enemy aircraft before they could launch weapons. But the real conditions of the Falklands imposed challenges that rarely appeared in NATO exercises. Argentine attacks were carried out at extremely low altitude, almost skimming the sea's surface. This drastically reduced radar detection range, limited by the curvature of the Earth and by so-called clutter, the noise created by waves. 4 radar operators distinguishing an enemy aircraft from natural interference required constant focus and rapid judgment. On the day of the attack, Sheffield faced a dilemma common in modern warfare: too much information and too little time. There were multiple signals, fragmented alerts, and simultaneous communications with other ships and higher command. At one point, part of the ship's attention was focused on satellite transmissions considered critical for fleet coordination. This was not negligence, it was an operational priority defined by rational logic, until the context suddenly changed. When the Argentine superintendents approached, they did so with surgical precision. They used a patrol aircraft to identify targets, flew in radar silence for most of the mission, and exposed their position for only a few seconds, just long enough to obtain a firing solution. It was within that narrow window that Sheffield's fate was sealed. There was no time for effective evasive maneuvering. No time to deploy countermeasures. Even if the alert had been interpreted differently, the gap between detection and impact was dangerously short. Modern naval warfare revealed an uncomfortable truth: detecting a threat is not enough. You must believe what you see and act immediately. The post-attack investigations were meticulous, almost painfully precise. The Royal Navy avoided turning the episode into a witch hunt. The goal was not to assign individual blame, but to understand the system as a whole. It became clear that excessive confidence in certain assumptions, such as the belief that an attack of this kind was unlikely or easily detected, had created a dangerous gray zone. In war, what seems improbable is often exactly what the enemy seeks to exploit. Another critical issue was damage control. The fire that doomed Sheffield exposed serious structural vulnerabilities. The choice of internal materials, compartmentalization, redundancy in electrical systems, everything was reassessed in the years that followed. The lesson was harsh: a ship can survive an impact, but not an uncontrollable fire. For the sailors who survived, these technical conclusions carried a deeply personal weight. Many would forever remember smoke-filled corridors, comrades disappearing into darkness, shouted orders that never reached everyone. These men did not fail. They faced a situation for which no one in peacetime can ever be fully prepared. Meanwhile, on the other side of the conflict, Argentina watched British reactions closely. The attack on Sheffield had proven that the enemy fleet could be wounded. But it also made clear that every remaining Exocet missile now had near strategic value and would be used with extreme caution. The war entered a new phase, more tense, more silent, more paranoid. British ships began operating as if every radar return could signal an imminent attack. Helicopters patrolled constantly. Improvised early warning aircraft tried to compensate for technological gaps. Mental fatigue among crews increased day after day. The fear was not irrational. It was learned. Every officer knew that if another ship were hit, the political and moral impact could be devastating. Sheffield had become a ghost present in every decision made in the South Atlantic. And yet, the fleet had to press on. Amphibious operations, landings on the islands, support for troops ashore, everything depended on these ships remaining in the combat zone. It was the purest definition of modern war, moving forward while knowing that the next mistake could be the last. Sheffield, silently, had taken on a new role. No longer as a destroyer but as a warning. Her name began to appear in briefings, studies, and simulations. A real, recent case that could not be ignored. Not as a symbol of incompetence, but as proof that at sea, the margin for error is always smaller than it seems. With the immediate operational analyses concluded and the campaign inevitably moving forward, something deeper began to take shape within the Royal Navy, and soon after, across virtually every Western Navy. It was not just a technical correction. It was a shift in mindset. Sheffield had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Modern naval warfare would not be decided solely by who had the best radar, the fastest missile, or the strongest hull. It would be decided by the ability to survive the initial hit. And that ability did not lie in external sensors but inside the ship. Until then, many naval designs prioritized performance, range, and electronic sophistication. Damage control mattered, but it was rarely decisive in exercises. The fire aboard Sheffield changed that permanently. Post-war reports were unambiguous. Flammable internal materials had to be replaced. Compartmentalization had to be strengthened. Electrical systems needed real redundancy, not just theoretical backups. And above all, crew training for complex fires began to be treated as a matter of survival, not procedure. Ships do not die when they are hit. They die when they lose internal control. That lesson echoed far beyond the South Atlantic. For the sailors who had served aboard Sheffield, returning to the United Kingdom brought no immediate relief. Many carried physical injuries. Others bore invisible scars. The silence of shore corridors contrasted violently with memories of smoke, heat, and helplessness. The Royal Navy acknowledged this human cost. The ship came to be remembered officially not merely as a material loss, but as a sacrifice. The 20 men who died were not numbers in a report. They were part of a generation of sailors who fought a short, distant, and brutally lethal war. Sheffield's memory also influenced later strategic decisions. Ship positioning, the way radar pickets were used, escort doctrines, and sensor integration all underwent deep revision. The idea that a single ship could operate in isolation, even a modern one, became increasingly unacceptable. The sea does not forgive isolation. Internationally, the impact was immediate. Allied nations studied every detail of the attack and its consequences. The Exocet missile, already known, became almost a psychological symbol, not because it was invincible but because it represented something new, the possibility of a decisive strike without direct confrontation. Navies that once relied on armor, speed, or sheer firepower began investing heavily in electronic countermeasures, early warning systems, and, most critically, rapid response doctrines. The time between detection and decision had to be reduced to seconds, or less. The attack on Sheffield proved that there is no such thing as almost safe in naval combat. In Argentina, the episode also left its mark. While seen as a tactical success, it exposed clear limits. The scarcity of missiles, dependence on a few launch platforms, and the difficulty of repeating surprise showed that modern warfare favors those who can learn and adapt fastest. After Sheffield, the British learned quickly. The remainder of the campaign was conducted under the constant shadow of that attack. Every aerial approach was treated as potentially fatal. Every decision carried the weight of lives that could not be lost again in the same way. And yet the fleet stayed. It advanced. It completed its mission. Sheffield did not win the war, but it taught how to survive it. Decades later, the ship's name is still cited in naval academies, planning rooms, and studies of maritime warfare, not as an isolated failure but as a turning point. It marks the moment when naval warfare fully entered the missile age, and when it became clear that technology without human preparedness is nothing more than wasted potential. For the men who were aboard on May 4th, none of this was theory. It was raw reality felt on the skin, in the lungs, in memory. They did not face an enemy fleet on the horizon. They faced seconds of uncertainty and minutes of chaos. And that was enough to change modern naval history. As the campaign progressed, Sheffield ceased to be just a ship that had been lost. It became a silent, almost omnipresent reference point in the minds of every British commander and sailor in the South Atlantic. There was no need to mention it out loud all the time. A suspicious radar contact was enough. An incomplete warning from another ship was enough. A blip that appeared and vanished on a green screen was enough. In each of those moments, the memory surfaced automatically. This is how it began with Sheffield. Naval warfare shifted into a state of near-constant vigilance. Not only physical vigilance but mental. The most dangerous enemy was no longer just the aircraft or the missile. It was misinterpretation, a delay of seconds, the hesitation between alerting the entire fleet or assuming it was just another false echo. That constant tension took its toll. Crews slept little. Radar operators stayed at their consoles for extra hours. Officers made decisions with the weight of entire lives on their shoulders. The technology was still there, still functioning, but now everyone knew it offered no guarantees. Only probabilities. And war is where probabilities are rarely enough. Sheffield also exposed something even deeper, the fragility of the boundary between peacetime and wartime. Many of the systems, materials, and procedures that failed that day were considered acceptable before the conflict. They had been approved, tested, certified. But none of that had been done under real fire. The Falklands War was short but brutally honest. It offered no luxury of slow adaptation. Every mistake was punished immediately. Every success was rewarded only with the chance to remain alive for another day. The attack on Sheffield was one of those moments of absolute honesty. It showed that the modern sea grants no extended second chances. That distance does not protect. That the invisible enemy is the most dangerous of all. And that excessive confidence can be just as lethal as an enemy weapon. Over the years, public narratives have often tried to simplify the episode. To reduce it to a radar failure, to a missile that didn't explode, to a specific decision made in a combat information center. But for those who understand the sea, and for those who were there, the story was never that simple. Sheffield was lost to a convergence of factors that aligned at the worst possible moment. A capable enemy. A system pushed to its limits. Exhausted men. Incomplete information. And a weapon designed precisely to exploit those gaps. None of this diminishes the courage of the crew. On the contrary. The ship's resistance after the impact, the prolonged attempt to save her, and the discipline shown during evacuation demonstrate that even when technology fails, the human element can hold everything together longer than expected. And sometimes that extra time is all that exists. Sheffield did not meet a glorious end in open battle. She did not trade broadsides with the enemy. She did not sink amid spectacular explosions. Her end was quiet, slow, almost discreet, exactly like the kind of war that destroyed her. But her legacy was deafening. She redefined naval construction standards, changed training, altered doctrine, and above all, made it clear that in the missile age survival is as important as attack. Every ship that sails today with less flammable materials, safer compartments, and crews obsessively trained in damage control carries, indirectly, the mark of Sheffield. And every sailor who takes a combat watch knowing that seconds matter is, in some way, inheriting that lesson, written in smoke over the South Atlantic. As time passed, the name Sheffield ceased to be merely an operational reference or a technical case study. It came to occupy a quieter, deeper place, the realm of the war's collective memory. For the Royal Navy, it was not just the loss of a destroyer. It was the loss of a certainty. The certainty that peacetime preparation, no matter how rigorous, would be enough when real war arrived. The South Atlantic proved otherwise. The sailors who survived carried that awareness with them for the rest of their careers. Many continued to serve. Others left the Navy. But all of them came to understand naval combat differently, not as a strategic abstraction, but as a fragile, unstable experience in which control can vanish in minutes. In later testimonies, several described the same feeling. The moment they realized that the ship, that space which had felt solid, safe, almost invulnerable, had turned into a trap. Not because of moral failure, not because of cowardice, but because modern war does not respect the psychological comfort of those who enter it. Sheffield taught that lesson in the harshest possible way. At naval academies, its name began to appear not only in history classes, but in practical training. The focus shifted from simply how to avoid being hit, to an equally critical question: what to do after you are hit. That shift may sound simple, but it represented a profound rupture. For decades, naval doctrine had emphasized perfect interception, layered defenses, the idea that a well-protected ship simply would not be reached. The Exocet missile proved that this view was overly optimistic. Something will always get through. There will always be a failure. There will always be a moment when the enemy wins the technological race. And when that happens, only the human capacity to react remains. Training became more realistic, more exhausting, closer to real chaos. Fires simulated in confined spaces. multiple failures occurring at once, communications deliberately degraded. All of it because, on Sheffield, nothing failed in isolation. Everything failed together. The psychological impact of the loss also reshaped how the Royal Navy viewed its own sailors. The recognition of trauma, rarely discussed in earlier generations, began to gain space. The Falklands War was short, but intense enough to leave lasting scars. For many, the attack on Sheffield was the moment the war stopped being a distant mission and became personal. It was no longer just about retaking islands. It was about surviving the next invisible threat. And that changed behavior at sea. Ships began operating with wider safety margins. Conservative decisions, once seen as excessive caution, became acceptable. Better to abort an operation than lose another ship. Better to react to a false alarm than ignore a real attack. Sheffield bought that prudence with blood. Over the years, public narratives about the Falklands War have often highlighted victories, successful landings, and firm political decisions. But behind the scenes of naval history, Sheffield remained an uncomfortable reminder that every victory was accompanied by extreme risks and real losses. It was not the only ship hit during the conflict. Others would be damaged, some severely. But Sheffield was the first. And, as is often the case, the first shock is the one that transforms the most. It was there that modern naval warfare ceased to be a theoretical concept for the Royal Navy. It was there that it became clear, once and for all, that there is no invulnerability at sea, only imperfect preparation against unpredictable threats. And at the center of it all were the men. Sailors who never saw the missile coming. Who felt only the impact, the heat, the smoke. Who fought for a ship already doomed. Who survived carrying names they would never forget. Sheffield no longer speaks. She no longer sails. She no longer fights. But she remains present, in every cautious decision, in every exhausting drill, and in every respectful silence when her name is spoken. With the passage of years, something curious happens to stories like that of Sheffield. They stop being merely events and begin to function as permanent warnings. No matter how many generations pass, how many new systems are installed, or how many more advanced ships enter service, Sheffield remains there, an invisible line no one wants to cross again. During the Falklands War, after the attack, every night at sea carried a different weight. The South Atlantic was no longer just dark and cold. It was hostile. A space where any point on the horizon could hide an aircraft, where any silence on the radio might mean preparations for an attack. Sailors began to measure time differently. No longer in watches or days, but in intervals between alerts. Between detected takeoffs. Between held breaths as a contact approached, or disappeared. Sheffield had taught that the most dangerous attack is the one that barely announces itself. For younger officers, many of them in their first real experience of combat, the loss of the ship had an almost initiatory effect. Until then, modern naval warfare had been something learned from books, simulators, and carefully controlled exercises. After Sheffield, it was felt in the gut. The idea that a ship could be lost without an exchange of fire, without a visible battle, was hard to accept. But that was precisely the new reality. The missile age had removed combat from the visual field. The enemy no longer needed to be seen to be lethal. That realization changed behavior almost instinctively. Bridges grew quieter. Orders became more direct. Informality diminished, not out of excessive rigidity but because everyone knew a moment of distraction could be the last. Sheffield was not remembered as a grotesque mistake, but as a warning. Modern war punishes normality. Even after the conflict ended, that lesson did not fade. It followed the Royal Navy home. It influenced reforms, internal debates, and budgetary decisions. At a time when many navies believed large-scale naval wars belonged to the past, Sheffield argued otherwise. It proved that limited, regional, and politically distant conflicts could still be brutally intense. And that in such conflicts technology does not reduce risk, it merely redistributes it. The Exocet missile did not win because it was perfect. It won because it exploited a tiny window. A space between expectation and reality. Between what was believed possible and what actually happened. And that may be the most uncomfortable lesson of all. The men aboard that ship on May 4th did not go into combat expecting to become part of history. They were doing what sailors have always done, keeping watch, following orders, trusting their systems and one another. When the impact came, there was no time for cinematic heroism. There was only reaction. Attempts. Mistakes. Successes. People saving people amid smoke and heat. This is the real face of modern naval warfare, silent, fast, and profoundly human. Sheffield did not fall because her sailors failed. She fell because modern war creates situations where even correct decisions can lead to fatal outcomes. And that haunts anyone who works at sea. As the world moved into new decades with new conflicts and new threats, the name Sheffield continued to be invoked, not as a ghost of the past but as a point of reference. A reminder that every technological advance brings new vulnerabilities with it. Ships became stealthier, sensors more sophisticated. Automated systems took over tasks once performed by humans. But in essence, the dilemma remained the same. See first, decide first, survive the first impact. None of that is guaranteed. And perhaps that is exactly why the story of Sheffield continues to be told. As the months passed, and then the years, the story of Sheffield began to take on a curious shape within the Royal Navy itself. It ceased to be something merely remembered and became something internalized. Not as an isolated trauma, but as a silent reference, almost invisible, present in every routine on board. For those who have never lived at sea, it is difficult to understand how a single event can alter the collective behavior of thousands of men. But on warships, where space is limited and risk is constant, memory spreads quickly. It seeps into habits, into silences, into decisions that seem trivial on the surface. After Sheffield, vigilance stopped being just a technical function. It became a state of mind. Radar operators learned to distrust what they saw, and, paradoxically, to trust their own intuition more. Officers learned that incomplete reports still had to be taken seriously. And ordinary sailors came to understand that, in combat, the line between normality and catastrophe is almost invisible. On board, the sea remained the same. Cold waves, constant wind, endless nights. But something had changed in the way men looked toward the horizon. It was no longer just empty space. It was a possible vector of death. Routine in the South Atlantic after the attack on Sheffield was marked by a cruel contradiction. Nothing happened, until everything happened at once. Entire days could pass without confirmed enemy contact. Tension would slowly ease. Conversations would emerge. Bodies would try to relax. And then suddenly an alert would shatter it all. An uncertain contact. A weak signal. A hurried warning passed between ships. Every alarm now carried disproportionate weight. The fear did not come only from the possibility of an attack, but from the memory of how the last one had occurred. Fast, almost invisible, decisive. Sheffield had shown that it did not take a grotesque mistake to lose a ship. It only took a short sequence of poorly aligned events. That realization quietly eroded confidence. From a human perspective, this permanent state of alert had deep effects. Fatigue was not only physical. It was cognitive. Making repeated decisions under pressure with incomplete information wears down even the most experienced professionals. On the bridge, in operations rooms, on the decks, men began to carry the weight of a responsibility that is hard to explain outside that context. Knowing that a minimal delay could cost dozens of lives. Sheffield was not mentioned in those moments. It didn't need to be. It was implicit in every conservative choice, in every order to assume the worst-case scenario. And yet, the mission had to continue. There is something profoundly unfair about modern naval warfare. It demands continuous perfection from those on defense, while granting the attacker the advantage of a single successful strike. Sheffield was a victim of this asymmetry. Argentina needed to get it right once. The Royal Navy needed to get it right every time. This structural imbalance would become one of the great subjects of study after the war, not only in the United Kingdom but in navies around the world. Naval air defense came to be seen not as an absolute shield, but as a race against time. Every second between detection and impact came to be treated as too precious to waste. Meanwhile, far from decision centers and strategic analyses, there were ordinary men. Sailors who, at night, lay in narrow bunks, listening to the constant sound of the hull cutting through the sea. Many of them thought of the comrades lost on Sheffield. Others avoided thinking altogether. Fear, when constant, does not always manifest as panic. Sometimes it appears as silence, as excessive rigidity, as restrained humor, as a permanent sense that something is about to happen. This was the emotional legacy of Sheffield during the rest of the campaign. The sunken ship was no longer physically present, but its absence was felt every day. It represented what could happen again. It represented the invisible boundary between control and chaos. And perhaps that is why, even decades later, the story of Sheffield still causes discomfort. Because it offers no simple villain. No clear solution. It shows only how modern war works when everything happens too fast for regret. Over time, the story of Sheffield came to occupy a delicate space between what can be explained and what can only be felt. For analysts, it was a case study. For engineers, a set of correctable failures. For strategists, a lesson in asymmetry and surprise. But for the sailors, especially those who lived through that May of 1982, Sheffield was something far simpler and far heavier. It was proof that a war does not need to be long to be definitive. Within the Royal Navy, the episode began to influence not only procedures, but the very way risk was understood. Before, many decisions were made based on probabilities. After Sheffield, thinking shifted toward consequences. It no longer mattered how small the chance of an attack might be. If the potential impact was catastrophic, it had to be treated as real. That change in mindset may seem subtle, but it transforms everything. It alters the rhythm of operations. It increases the psychological burden. It makes command more lonely. Because deciding under this principle often means halting actions, defying expectations and accepting criticism, all to avoid repeating a tragedy that has already proven possible. Sheffield had shown that unlikely is not the same as impossible. In the years following the war, naval exercises began to simulate increasingly extreme scenarios. Multiple attacks, simultaneous failures, fires out of control, total loss of power. Everything that had seemed exaggerated before 1982 was now treated as a plausible routine. These drills were not heroic. They were dirty, chaotic, exhausting, exactly like the real fight inside Sheffield after the impact. The goal was not to win the exercise but to learn how not to die quickly. And that may be the ship's harshest legacy, the acceptance that in modern naval combat, survival itself is already a form of victory. There is also a less discussed, but fundamental, aspect. The attack on Sheffield exposed the gap between those who design war and those who live it. Systems are conceived in offices. Doctrines are written in calm times. But real application happens in chaotic environments, with people who are tired, afraid, and pressed by seconds that will not return. Sheffield did not fail only as a platform. It revealed the fragility of the link between theory and practice. That does not mean incompetence. It means humanity. The men operating those systems were not interchangeable parts. They were individuals trying to make correct decisions in a scenario where no decision felt fully safe. Modern war demands instant responses to unprecedented problems, and that exacts a psychological cost no manual can fully anticipate. In the decades that followed, other conflicts would echo the same dilemma. Modern ships struck by relatively simple weapons. Advanced systems surprised by creative attacks. Always the same pattern. The attacker needs to succeed once. The defender must succeed every time. Sheffield was one of the first major warnings of this new era. It was not the last, but it was one of the clearest. And perhaps that is why its story continues to be told with such care. Because it does not fit neatly into narratives of absolute victory or shameful defeat. It inhabits an uncomfortable space where courage and vulnerability coexist. Sheffield was not lost to cowardice. It was not lost to ignorance. It was lost because modern war creates situations where even adequate preparation can be insufficient. And accepting that is deeply unsettling. As we approach the end of this narrative, one thing becomes clear. The true impact of Sheffield is not found only in the burned hull that sank into the South Atlantic. It lies in how it changed behaviors, decisions, and awareness. But there is still one final layer to explore. The quietest of all. There is a final layer in the story of Sheffield that rarely appears in reports, charts, or strategic analyses. It is not tied to systems, missiles, or command decisions. It is tied to silence. The silence that comes afterward. When the war ends, ships return, flags are folded away, and official statements come to a close, a strange space remains, an interval in which events have not yet been shaped into organized memory. For many of the men who served in the South Atlantic, Sheffield lingered in that interval for a long time. Not as a remembered explosion but as an absence. The ship was no longer in formation. Its name was no longer called over the radio. Yet its absence was felt whenever the sea grew too calm. For the survivors, there was a particular difficulty in explaining what had happened. How do you describe losing a modern warship without ever seeing the enemy? How do you put into words the experience of fighting a fire that seemed alive, moving through corridors, consuming everything in its path? Modern naval warfare does not produce easy stories to tell. There are no clear front lines. No visible duels. Only abrupt moments when normality shatters, and then a long effort to piece things back together. Sheffield belongs to that kind of war. A war where impact comes before understanding. Where comprehension arrives too late to change the outcome. As time passed, many of those sailors went on with their lives. Some stayed at sea. Others never wanted to set foot on a warship again. But in different ways they all carried the same awareness. They had seen the future of naval warfare before the world was ready to accept it. A future where distance does not protect, where sophistication does not guarantee safety, where the mistake does not need to be large to be fatal. That awareness creates a particular kind of maturity. It is not heroic. It is not optimistic. It is quiet, cautious, and deeply realistic. Sheffield also changed how loss is perceived within a modern navy, not as absolute failure, but as an inevitable cost of operating in an environment where technological advantage is never permanent. That does not make the loss acceptable, but it makes it understandable. And understanding in this context is essential to avoid repetition. There is something profoundly human in the fact that, decades later, Sheffield is remembered not only for how it was lost but for what it taught. It taught that modern war offers no guarantees, that systems fail, that people make mistakes, and that, even so, decisions must still be made. It taught that courage is not only found in attacking, but in remaining at your post knowing the next threat may be invisible. And it taught, perhaps above all, that naval warfare truly entered a new era on May 4, 1982, an era where seconds decide destinies, and where survival itself became an objective as complex as victory. We are now very close to the historical and human conclusion of this narrative. All that remains is to bring everything together in one final movement, the one that transforms facts, decisions, and memories into lasting meaning. There are stories that end when the last shot is fired. Sheffield is not one of them. It continues because it touches something that remains true regardless of era, flag, or technology. At sea, time is never on the side of those who make mistakes. After the Falklands, the naval world entered a period of apparent calm. The Cold War was nearing its end, large-scale naval conflicts seemed increasingly unlikely, and many believed that episodes like Sheffield would become rare, almost too historical to be repeated. But the unease never fully disappeared. In planning rooms, whenever someone suggested excessive confidence in a specific system, the name Sheffield would surface. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes only as a pause in the conversation, a heavy silence before someone asked, "What if one gets through?" Because that is the question Sheffield left without a definitive answer. What if one gets through? Modern naval warfare is built on layers of protection, redundancies, overlapping sensors, and automated responses. But none of those layers are perfect. All of them, at some point, depend on human interpretation. And human interpretation depends on context, psychological state, fatigue, and experience. On Sheffield, there was no moral collapse. There was something more subtle, and more dangerous: normality in an environment that no longer allowed normality. That is one of the hardest legacies to accept. The ship was not in panic. It was not disorganized. It was operating within parameters that, until then, had seemed reasonable. The war changed those parameters, and did so without clear warning. That is how modern war often behaves. For those who study history from a distance, there is a temptation to look for the exact moment when everything could have gone differently. An alert interpreted another way. A system activated a few minutes earlier. A decision made more aggressively. But the truth is that Sheffield was not lost because of a single wrong choice. It was lost because of a series of plausible choices, made in an environment where the margin for plausibility had vanished. That makes the story harder to digest, and more important to remember. The human impact extends far beyond the original crew. Every sailor who today enters a modern operations center, surrounded by screens and data, indirectly inherits that experience. Even without knowing every detail, they feel the culture that was born there. A culture of healthy distrust, rapid response, and awareness that the worst-case scenario is not paranoia, it is planning. Sheffield shaped that culture without needing to exist physically. It became a fixed point in a collective memory that crosses generations. And perhaps that is the most powerful aspect of the entire story. Ships are built to operate for decades. Some last longer, some less. But few leave a mark that survives the steel itself. Sheffield did. Not as a symbol of defeat but as a dividing line. Before it, there was the belief that technology was always one step ahead of the threat. After it, there was an understanding that the threat also learns, also observes, also waits for the right moment. And when that moment arrives, there is no time for revisions. When we look at naval warfare from the present day, with its automated systems, integrated networks, and sensors capable of seeing beyond the horizon, it is tempting to believe that episodes like Sheffield belong to an outdated past. But that feeling is misleading. Time has passed, technology has advanced, and the central dilemma has remained. Sheffield was not a historical anomaly. It was a warning. Since then, Navies around the world have invested billions to reduce the gap between detection and response. Algorithms have replaced part of human decision-making. Automated systems now react faster than any operator ever could. But this acceleration has brought a new burden. When everything happens in seconds, mistakes become easier to make, and far more final. What was once human hesitation can now become overconfidence in the machine. And that transition quietly carries the same shadow cast by Sheffield. In modern exercises, instructors often place crews in nearly impossible scenarios. Multiple threats, contradictory alerts, degraded systems. All designed to force a question that has never lost its relevance. What do you do when you don't have absolute certainty? Sheffield teaches that waiting for certainty can be fatal. That lesson has shaped entire generations of officers and sailors. Not in the sense of acting irrationally, but in understanding that war at sea offers no intellectual comfort. It demands decisions made with incomplete information and total consequences. The ship lost in 1982 remains present precisely in those moments, when someone must choose between sounding a general alarm or assuming that it's probably nothing. There is also a cruel irony in the story. Sheffield was part of a fleet sent to reaffirm control, deterrence, and military credibility. And it was precisely its loss that made that credibility real in the eyes of the world. From that moment on, no one doubted that the Falklands War was serious. That it would cost lives. That it would demand sacrifice. Sheffield gave the campaign a weight no official communiqué ever could. It turned abstraction into reality. For sailors who live at sea today, the story of Sheffield does not appear as paralyzing fear, but as a constant backdrop. A reminder that a ship is both protection and vulnerability. That steel does not guarantee invincibility. That the true limit always lies in the interaction between people and systems. And that creates an almost intimate relationship with risk. Every night watch. Every shift in the combat information center. Every alert that breaks the silence of the ocean. All of it carries echoes of that 4th of May. Sheffield also reinforced a truth that rarely appears in public speeches. Modern naval warfare is, above all, a war of nerves. Those who maintain clarity under extreme pressure gain the advantage. Those who normalize risk lose. That is a legacy difficult to convey outside the naval world. But within it, it is felt every day. And perhaps that is why the name Sheffield was never forgotten. Not because it represents failure, but because it represents a lesson paid for at too high a cost to ever be ignored. Sheffield did not come home. And yet, it never truly left the sea. When the South Atlantic closed over the burned hull of that modern destroyer, it wasn't only steel, cables, and compartments that went down. What sank with it was an old idea, comfortable but dangerous, that advanced technology alone was enough to dominate war at sea. What rose from that wreck was something harsher, more honest, closer to reality. Modern naval warfare is not a contest of invulnerability. It is a succession of bets made under pressure, where every second carries human weight. Where sophisticated systems coexist with fatigue, fear, noise, and doubt. Where there is no perfect defense, only responses fast enough to keep people alive. Sheffield showed this without mercy. For the 20 men who died, the war ended in smoke-filled corridors, in desperate attempts to contain a fire that obeyed neither hierarchy nor manuals. Their deaths were not the result of bravado or gross mistakes. They were the direct consequence of a world that had changed faster than the certainties meant to sustain it. And that is what makes this story so hard to ignore. There is no easy comfort in it. No simple villains. No magic solutions. There is only the realization that, at sea, a single mistake can be enough. Decades later, every ship that sails with stricter damage control protocols, every crew trained to exhaustion for the worst-case scenario, every commander who chooses to act before absolute certainty carries, consciously or not, the legacy of Sheffield. It lives in alarms that are not ignored. In conservative decisions that save lives. In the refusal to treat the improbable as irrelevant. That is the true impact of the Exocet missile launched on May 4, 1982. Not merely the destruction of a ship, but the definitive transformation of modern naval thinking. Sheffield was not a symbol of weakness. It was a turning point. It marked the moment when it became clear that war at sea had entered a silent, fast, and unforgiving era. An era in which the enemy may never be seen, in which battles begin and end in minutes, and in which the difference between coming home or not can hinge on a decision made under doubt. That is Sheffield's real legacy. A legacy written not in triumphant speeches, but in names engraved on memorials. In rewritten protocols. In the respectful silences aboard ships that know exactly what is at stake. The sea remains the same. Cold. Indifferent. Vast. But since that day, those who sail armed upon it know this. Technology helps. Strategy guides. But it is the human factor, under extreme pressure, that decides everything. And that is a lesson the ocean charges only once.